Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm going to be doing this drawing of an eagle in colored pencils on sandpaper. Let's get to it. I drew the outline with a green colored pencil because I'm going to be doing the background, or at least some of the background first, and it's mostly going to be with green pencils. I'm going to be using mostly Faber Castell colored pencils, mostly Polychromous, but some others as well. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. I'm also going to use a bunch of these paper blending tortillions, homemade, and some erasers, although I won't be using them that much. So the paper that I'm using is waterproof sandpaper. It's just regular sandpaper that you can buy in any hardware store, and the grit is 1000, so it's a fine sandpaper. I find that it works pretty well with colored pencils. You can do stuff on it that you can't do on regular paper, like blend a bit more easily and layer many different colors and go from dark to light and from light to dark. Those are some of the things that you can't really do on regular drawing paper. So my subject is going to be an eagle, and I'm first going to do a background, and the background is going to be a combination of some lighter greens and some darker yellowish greens. I mostly want to have sort of an olive green, yellowish green background with some variation in terms of value. Now, as you can see, I'm doing most of the blending with these tortillions, which I make myself. I just roll them into I just roll a piece of paper into a nice tortillion, and I can use it for blending. Now, as you can tell, I am pressing against this paper, and some people would probably find that sound a little bit unpleasant. I don't have a problem with it. It's not really wearing down the tooth of the paper as fast as you would think. So I can easily add some more layers and add some more shades of green and experiment a little bit to see what works best. In addition to the tortillions, I can occasionally blend a little bit with my finger or with brushes, but I don't really recommend using a finger much here because it's not pastel, it's colored pencil. It doesn't spread as well as pastel, and of course the sandpaper can be a little bit rough on your fingers and it can wear down your skin pretty quickly. So another useful thing about this background that I'm going to be doing is the fact that I can use it to create some contrast with my main subject, because the eagle is going to have some lighter parts, especially on the head and the beak. There's going to be some highlights, and I'm going to want those lighter areas to stand out in contrast against the background. One of the great things about working with colored pencils on sandpaper is that you can have some of the advantages of colored pencils, like for example the precision and the cleanliness of the colored pencil, because you can create some very nice fine clean lines with colored pencils, and you can do some of the things that, as I've already mentioned, you can't do on regular paper, like for example draw lighter lines on top of the darker values, and that allows you to create very nice contrast and to create some very clean edges that would be very difficult to achieve without using erasers and planning a lot ahead. So here you can allow yourself to be a lot more spontaneous. There's a little bit more room for mistake, and it's just, I think, more enjoyable to work with colored pencils on sanded papers. I honestly have no idea how other sanded papers will behave. I'm only using this regular sandpaper, although I will continue to experiment with this combination. But some of the high quality sanded papers are hard to find, and they're also pretty expensive, so in case you don't have those, I think this regular hardware store sandpaper, as long as it's a finer grit, will actually perform very well with both colored pencils and pastel pencils. And another thing that I've often talked about when working with this combination of media is that, in my experience, on sandpaper, colored pencils tend to behave more like pastel pencils rather than regular colored pencils, rather than the way that regular colored pencils behave on regular drawing paper. So their performance is a lot more similar to pastel pencils, because it's easier to move around that pigment and because they fill the tooth of the paper much faster than they would on regular paper. So I'm working on the eye here, and I've slowed down a little bit so that you can watch a part of the drawing process. My videos are usually a combination of time-lapse and real-time. Some people complain that I don't do all of it in real time, but if you want to see longer real-time videos, you're going to have to go and check out my Patreon. On my main channel here, I make some longish videos where you can observe at least some part of the process in real time. So I use quite a bit of shades of these orange and yellow colors for the eye. I want it to look very nice and complex, and I want this highlight in the eye, that reflection, to stand out. That's why I had to shade around it, and I had to create this nice transition from the darker brown tones to the lighter yellow tones. And I'm also adding some small detail and texture to the eye so that it looks a little bit more interesting. One of the videos that kind of inspired me to do this was a video that I've seen a long time ago. It was a pastel drawing of an eagle, and the woman doing that portrait was also doing a portrait of a very similar eagle, and was doing a close-up drawing of an eagle's eye. And I thought that the process was quite fascinating, so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this one. And also it's one of the reasons why I moved on to drawing the eye here first, because I thought that it would be the most interesting part of this drawing. And it was the most interesting part, and probably one of the easier parts of this drawing process. And here, as you can see, I'm moving on to the beak. I'm putting down some of the lighter colors first, and I'm going to be adding some of the darker spots a bit later. Now, for the main color of the eagle, we're going to be using some flesh tones and ochreish tones and some brownish tones. But I'm going to be blending all of that with tortillons. And trying to make these nice transitions. So I want the upper part of the beak to be lighter and almost completely white, and the same is going to be the case with some of the with some of the feathers on the top of the head because they are facing towards the light source. So the light source is coming from above, and the feathers and the top part of the head will be a lot lighter. And there's going to be a bit of shadow under the animal's beak and around the neck. So I'm adding some scratches and some texture to the beak to make that part of the eagle's body a bit more realistic. So I'm adding some random texture. I'm going to add some variation in color and texture, and I'm going to add some scratches to it. Because they use their beaks for all kinds of things, and no doubt the surface of it gets a little bit damaged and rough. And one other good thing about working with colored pencils on sandpaper is that I find it easier to combine black with other tones to create darker tones. So normally that's not what experienced artists recommend, but it kind of works for me, and it works a little bit better on sandpaper. It's a little bit easier to create those dark tones just by sort of cheating and using black rather than searching for the right combination of colors. So here around the eye, in this transition area between the beak and the eye, there are some very, very small, short, thin, fine feathers that almost look like hairs. Or maybe they are hairs, I don't really know what they are. But I'm going to draw those using a combination of mostly ivory color and dark brown. But first I'm drawing the mouth and the beak, and there are some yellow tones here and some darker colors here on the lower part of that beak. And I'm going to use a tortillon here to make this transition from the darker to the lighter value. But this is a shadow area under the beak, and there's going to be a little bit more of that black and darker colors there. And because of the reflected light, there's also a small line of lighter color on the lower side of that beak. So I'm filling in the rest of the background around the beak and around the left side of the eagle, because I want to get that out of the way before I move on to drawing the rest of the eagle's body and the head. And again, I'm going to be using this combination of greens. It's safe for me to do this because I normally work from left to right because I'm right-handed. So I'm first going to get this left part of the background out of the way, and then I'm going to move on to drawing the eagle. A few more words about my materials. Like I said, I'm mostly using Faber Castell Polychromous colored pencils, but I'm also using some regular Faber Castell colored pencils like Color Grip and maybe a couple of Stadlers as well, but mostly Faber Castell Polychromous. You can use any brand, it's just that I find that these Polychromous are pretty durable, and they also have some vibrant, strong colors. Another thing that you'll experience, and some people already asked me about this, is that sandpaper is a little bit rough, and you will often feel like it's wearing down your pencils very quickly. It's not so much that it's wearing down your pencils quickly, your pencils will also be covering larger areas a lot more quickly than they do on regular paper. So you are using your pencils more rapidly, but you're also getting more of the job done, more of the coloring job done much more quickly. So I'm now drawing these fine, smaller feathers around the beak, and as you can see, it's easy for me to add some lighter hairs on top. If I add some brown, I can just go over that with some white or ivory. For most of these lighter areas on the eagle, I'm using the ivory colored pencil because it's off-white, it's just a little bit yellowish, but not completely white. So it works well for some of these lighter feathers and for some of the highlights. For some of the lighter areas which need to be a little bit cooler, I did use the regular white, like for example on the beak, and some other areas like for example the highlight in the eye and stuff like that. So on the top of the head we have some lighter values, and the feathers are kind of less distinct in terms of their shape because they're smaller and because they're kind of facing away from the viewer. So I don't really need to do too much in terms of defining them. So I think, as you can see, the eagle is coming along nicely, and I haven't even got to the hard part yet. But I've done the eye, which will probably be the most noticeable part of the drawing. That's where most of the viewers will focus first. And the eye looks pretty good. So now I'm adding some more of these smaller brown feathers and brownish tones around the eye. And I'm going to be trying to work my way down to the neck and define some of the larger feathers. Now notice that for some of the lighter tones, the lighter brown tones on the eagle's head, I used a cinnamon colored pencil. This is the one that I'm using now, the cinnamon colored pencil. It's normally very good for drawing human skin. It's kind of similar to drawing human skin in combination with some other colors. But I find here that the tone was just right for what I was trying to achieve, but I later blended it with some other colors. Now notice that under the head and under the eagle's beak I defined this larger shadow area which is facing away from the light source. So there's a bit of shadow here. That's where the feathers will be a little bit darker. So you can see I kind of first blocked in this larger lighter area, and then I'm going to be adding some details in some darker areas to it. Now here under the head I'm adding some even darker colors using mostly black and this burnt umber. I'm going to be using several different browns, like for example a burnt umber, a walnut brown, and some others. But in addition to the cinnamon colored pencil, for some of the lighter areas I'm also going to be using that ochre colored pencil to get some of the warmer tones. Now here, as you can see, I'm using a darker colored pencil to define the individual feathers and to kind of split them up with shadow areas. But the feathers are still smaller and shorter here around the eye and on the head, which is why I still don't have to worry too much about their shape. But as I keep moving downwards towards the neck, the feathers will be getting larger and larger, and the shapes will be getting a little bit more complex. And that's kind of going to make my life and my job a little bit more difficult. I'm just adding some of these lighter colors here under the neck, which are catching some light, just to break up that shadow area a little bit and make it more interesting. And if I feel like I've produced too much texture and I want to soften it a little bit, I just go over it with a brush. So here I'm moving further down the neck and trying to define some more of these feathers. and this process is going to be getting more and more complex. So one of the things that often happens when I draw birds, not when I draw smaller portraits or smaller drawings of birds, but when I draw larger close-up drawings of birds, is that I often go through that phase where I tell myself, what were you thinking? Because I kind of don't like drawing feathers, and they are very complex to draw, and it can be difficult to understand the shape and how they are stacked on top of one another, and then you have to spend a lot of time shading to define each and every one of them, and to explain that shape and that structure to the viewer. So I really don't like drawing feathers, and I was drawn to this piece mostly because of the eagle's head and the beak and the eye. Of course, there are some very nice colors and some nice contrast there, but the feathers, I have to tell you, are not so much fun. But I'm going to have to do those as well, and I'm going to have to put in a lot of effort into them as well, so that I don't ruin the overall appearance of my drawing. So now I'm doing some lighter feathers here on this wing, and because they're catching a lot of light from above, and the wing is kind of facing upwards towards the light source, this whole area will be a little bit lighter. So I'm mostly going to be using a combination of that cinnamon color and the ivory color. But here under the neck, we're going to have some darker tones, and we're going to have some much darker feathers. So like I said, birds are a little bit complex to draw. Now I skipped over a part of the footage here where I drew some of the outlines of individual feathers on the neck, but now I'm going to be shading in between them, and that's the fun part, or the difficult part, depending on how you look at it. But there is no way around this process. You just have to slow down, you have to look at your reference photos, and you have to tell yourself, I need to take it easy, otherwise this just won't look good. And I'm kind of impatient. Even when I'm drawing realistic drawings, I like to find ways of making something look detailed and realistic without putting in too much effort and too much time into it. But here, I'm afraid that's not going to be possible. But one of the things that makes this process a lot easier and a lot less frustrating, obviously, is the fact that I'm working on sandpaper. If I wasn't working on sandpaper, all of this would be a lot more frustrating, and it would take a lot more time, because here I can easily go from dark to light. I can easily draw some highlights on top of the darker areas, and that makes it a lot easier for me to define these feathers, especially the tips of those feathers, because the feathers are stacked on top of one another in layers. The tip of them is kind of sticking outwards and catching more light from above, so it always has the tip always has to be a little bit lighter, or it's usually a little bit lighter. So one of the things that makes my job easier here is the fact that I'm working on sandpaper, and I can always put in some more lighter color on top of the darker values. Normally I wouldn't be able to do that on regular paper. I would just be muddying things, and maybe the lighter colors wouldn't even be visible, but here that's actually quite easy to do. And that way I can even add some texture to these feathers, add some of these finer, smaller lines to make the feathers look more realistic, and to make everything look a little more random and organic. So those are some of the things that you can do when you're working on sandpaper or on sanded papers. Now, as for the background, I'm going to get back to that now, because I didn't say everything I wanted to say about background. By the way, let me just comment on what I'm working on right now. I'm adding some warmer tones to these feathers here. I added a little bit of ochre because I felt like I needed to make those feathers look a little bit warmer. So in addition to the cinnamon and the darker browns that I used, I added some ochre just to get the right tone. But let me get back to talking about the background, because I kind of skipped over that. The background looks pretty smooth and out of focus, which is what I wanted to achieve. And it's easier to achieve that with colored pencils on sandpaper. But the even easier way to do that would be to use pastel pencils or soft pastels. Now, right now I'm in a phase where I'm experimenting only with colored pencils. I want to try to avoid using pastels or pastel pencils because I want to push this medium to its limits. I want to see what colored pencils can do on sanded paper. But later, in some of my other drawings, once I'm kind of done experimenting with colored pencils, I will probably go back to using a combination of pastel pencils and colored pencils, because I think that the background would be much easier and much quicker to do with pastel pencils, and I also think it would look a little bit better. But for the main subject and for the details, I will definitely continue to use colored pencils because I do think they are a lot better than pastels. So I think that in the future the combination that I'm going to be using will be my combination of pastel pencils and colored pencils on some kind of a sanded paper, either regular sandpaper, or maybe I'm going to find some other alternative. But I really do like this combination, and I think you can see the results. This eagle is starting to look really nice. Now, some of these feathers on the neck, as the bird is turning its head to one side, some of the feathers are kind of lifted up above the others, and there's a little bit more shadow under them, and I'm deepening that shadow using some darker colors like black and a dark brown. I want these feathers to really stand out against the rest of the neck. And I'm moving down the neck here, and I'm going to be adding some more feathers. The feathers on the wing are going to remain lighter as they are, but the feathers here will going to be mostly brownish in color. It's mostly going to be a combination of some brownish cinnamon and ochreish tones, but I'm also going to keep using that ivory colored pencil for the highlights and for the lighter areas, so that I can make the individual feathers stand out. Notice around the edges of the eagle, around the neck on the left, I added some flyaway, smaller feathers just to make the whole shape of the animal a little bit more interesting. And you can see that every time I draw one of these individual feathers, I go back and put in a little bit more of that darker value in between them, because there's shadow in between these feathers as they lay on top of one another. Here in this area, which I've already blocked in with some browns and the cinnamon, I'm adding some warmer colors of ochre, but then I go over it on top, adding some lighter values, and I just use the blending tools, the tortillions, to blend these colors together in those areas where I want to avoid having too much texture. So I'm kind of wrapping things up here, and in case you're wondering whether I'll be using any kind of a fixative on this drawing. I will be using Conte a Paris fixative spray. I'm just going to use a light coat so that I don't change the colors much, although that's usually more of a problem with pastels. But colored pencils tend to stick to the paper a little bit better, so it's not that much of a problem, but I'm just going to use a light coat over it. I'm kind of wrapping things up here. I'm just defining some of the feathers here in this lower right portion of the drawing, and that's kind of the shadow area because it's facing away from the light source. And I'm also trying to clean up some of the edges around the body of the bird, just to make sure that I have a clean edge and a nice contrast between the main subject and the background. And I'm drawing some of these flyaway hairs or flyaway feathers to break up the smooth surface of the head and the neck and to make it a little more interesting. And I'm also adding some of these ruffled feathers here and there to make the animal, the bird, look a little more realistic. So these are just some of the finishing touches. I'm just going to add a bit more shadow here between some of these feathers, and put back in some of the highlights. So here, as you can see, I've removed the tape and the board that it was taped to. The drawing here, by the way, was already sprayed with a bit of that fixative. As you can see, it hasn't changed much. It actually looks a little bit better in my opinion, but I just used a light coat. I'm going to put my signature here in the lower left corner, just a small signature. And now my drawing is almost done. I may just add a few more of these touches of ochre on this part of the wing here, because I felt that the color of the wing was a little bit too cool in comparison to the rest of the body, so I just added a few touches of ochre just to make the drawing a little bit more balanced in terms of the distribution of color. I hope you enjoyed the drawing process of this eagle, and I hope you like this technique. Let me know what you think in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe and give me a like. Thanks again for watching, and I'm going to see you in the next video. Bye for now.